Hello, and welcome to Underrated Entertainment, where I look at various bits of pop culture that I feel have never gotten enough appreciation.
Back to the Future is perhaps one of the most beloved movies to ever be produced by Universal Studios. For one thing, it is perhaps the most iconic time travel movie ever made, as evidenced by how well known the DeLorean time machine and the characters Marty McFly and Doc Brown are to this very day. It also stands out as an iconic 80s movie that has, if you'll pardon the expression, withstood the rigors of time, with its noticeable lack of cringy material that didn't age well. Of course, being a film that was also a huge financial success when it came out, Back to the Future ended up spawning a franchise that led to 2 sequels, an animated series, a now sadly defunct ride at various Universal parks,
Which I never got to ride.
and video games. Within this franchise, however, there is a film that has traditionally been seen as the weakest in the series, Back to the Future Part 3. I, however, consider it a really good finale to the trilogy of films, with its great use of setting, interesting characters, some of the best humor of the series, fantastic set pieces, and a conclusion that does a good job in wrapping up plot threads from the series in a satisfying way. Perhaps the most frequent criticisms of Part 3 regard the Western setting of the film, with some considering it a jumping the shark moment for the series, and others criticizing it as not having any basis in actual history, and is just comprised of regurgitating cliches from old westerns. In regards to the former, I would point out that since the series is set in a town in California, it makes sense that going back to 1885 would cause Marty to experience Hill Valley as a frontier town.
As simply looking at a map of the United States shows that, shockingly enough, California is part of the West.
Also, the presence of many individuals who would end up having descendants in 1985 helps to further the fleshing out of Hill Valley as a place that seems real by providing it with more of a history. In regards to the latter criticisms, while I would agree that the film does have some Western tropes that have very little basis in historical fact, such as Marty having a face-to-face showdown with Buford Tannen,
Yeah, in the real West you were more likely to get shot in the back than challenged to a duel.
there are various elements in the film that show that there was a serious consideration of the time period made by the filmmakers. First, there are the seemingly innocuous things like drinking water being mainly used for horses,
As the levels of alcohol consumption in the 19th century would make today's alcoholics seem like fucking lightweights.
and weapons being checked in at the entrance to the town's Clock Tower Dedication Festival.
Which was actually a common policy in a lot of Western towns, as it didn't take a lot of brains to realize that allowing heavily intoxicated men to keep their guns was a recipe for disaster.
Finally, the emphasis on how difficult it would be to conventionally power the time machine back then,
The internal combustion engine runs on ordinary gasoline. It always has. There's not going to be a gas station around here until sometime in the next century.
and how dangerous the use of a hijacked locomotive, being pushed to the limit to reach 88 miles per hour was,
Hopefully we'll hit 88 miles per hour before the needle gets much past 2,000.
Why? What happens after it hits 2,000?
The whole boiler explodes.
Perfect.
shows that there was serious consideration for the limits of late 19th century technology when the filmmakers were coming up with the solution to the problem of how Doc and Marty would return to 1985.
Instead of just pulling a random solution out of their asses.
Emmett Brown at your service, miss.
Clayton. Clara Clayton.
While I'm usually not a fan of falling in love instantly stories,
Which of course means I'm a huge fan of Valentine's Day.
the relationship between Doc and Clara Clayton is genuinely sweet, and serves an essential part of his arc in the series. While he is at first appalled to find out that he had inadvertently changed history by saving her from plummeting to her death in the ravine that, in the original timeline he and Marty remember, was named after her as a tribute,
Great Scott!
that she was supposed to go over in that wagon. And now I may have seriously altered history.
His subsequent interactions with her cause him to become further smitten with her. This results in him briefly considering staying in 1885 in order to be with her.
I mean, he's already dramatically changed the future by saving her, so why not just embrace it?
Only to be talked down by an incredulous Marty.
Think about it. What are you gonna say to her? I gotta go back to the future? I mean, she's not gonna understand that, Doc. Hell, I'm in it with you and I don't even understand it.
Although this does lead to an annoying third act breakup, it ends up becoming mute as Clara of course eventually finds out that Doc does love her and manages to catch up to him during the film's climax so that they can be together.
Cheesy? Oh, undoubtedly, but also sweet at the same time.
This in turn causes Doc to reassess his conviction earlier in the film that inventing time travel was a horrible mistake,
I wish I'd never invented that infernal time machine.
and brings him back to the initial enthusiasm for it that he had in the first film. Thus, Clara ends up being an essential positive influence on Doc, instead of just being a random love interest.
Mad Dog. I hate that name.
In Part 3, Marty and Doc have to contend with Buford Mad Dog Tannen, ancestor to bullying nemesis from the previous film's Biff Tannen, and perhaps the best villain of the series. Whereas Biff, for the most part, was an antagonist whose menace was limited to just beating up Marty, Buford, being a Western outlaw, regularly attempts to kill Marty and Doc. Also, being a resident of the late 19th century,
You know, the most PC of times.
he is more blatantly bigoted than his descendant.
He was quick on the trigger and bragged that he had killed 12 men, not including Indians or Chinamen.
In addition, being cognizant of how doing the opposite would probably result in a damaging butterfly effect, Marty and Doc are forced to use non-lethal means
In the tradition of the best versions of Batman,
to defeat him. All of this makes his humiliating and literally shitty defeat during the last act of the film all the more satisfying.
You got anything to say?
I hate manure.
Shot in the back by Buford Tannen over a matter of $80. What kind of a future do you call that?
While the first two films of the series had their fair share of humorous moments, I find that Part 3 is the one that personally makes me laugh the most.
He's an asshole.
For one thing, 1955 Doc's delayed reaction to seeing Marty again, at the beginning, is perhaps my favorite freak-out moment of his.
Doc, calm down, okay? Just calm down. It's me, it's Marty.
No, it can't be you. I sent you back to the future.
Hey, Doc, that's right, but I came back again. I came back from the future. Don't you remember last night? You fainted. I brought you home.
This can't be happening. You can't be here. It doesn't make sense for you to be here. I refuse to even believe that you are here.
In addition, the incredulous reaction of the people in 1885 to Marty's initial 1950-style cowboy outfit,
Why, I didn't know the circus was in town.
Must have got that shirt off on a dead Chinese.
and attempts to emulate the westerns he's familiar with,
What's your name, dude?
Mart Eastwood. Clint Eastwood.
What kind of stupid name is that?
are fun critiques of how old westerns usually bore little resemblance to the real West.
which, being a history buff, I really appreciate.
Also, the contrast between Buford Tannen's attempts to use lethal force and his insecurities about his own lack of intelligence are an additional outlet for laughter.
If you ain't here, I'll hunt you and shoot you down like a duck.
It's dog, Buford. Shoot him down like a dog.
Let's go, boys. Let these sissies have their party.
Finally, this movie has perhaps one of my favorite random jokes of the series.
Get the cavalry!
I don't know why, but that moment always makes me laugh my ass off every time I watch this movie.
Arguably the best part of the movie is the climactic train hijacking.
Range! Is this a hold-up? It's a science experiment!
While those who only compare things superficially,
You know, the clickbait YouTube critics.
would dismiss it as merely a repeat of the clock tower climax from the first film, given how it's all about trying to power the time machine to return to 1985, I would argue that it stands out in multiple ways. First of all, the stakes are higher in this attempt, as Marty and Doc have to get the time machine up to speed before it reaches the end of the unfinished railway at the ravine and plummets to an explosive doom with the locomotive pushing it.
Whereas in the first film, Marty was mostly faced with the prospect of being stuck in 1955 a little longer until he and Doc decided to try that nuclear bomb idea.
In addition, during this attempt there is the ever-present danger of the locomotive's boiler exploding from the steam pressure needed to get it up to 88 miles per hour, which nearly happens when the locomotive has its last abrupt burst of speed. Also, the last-minute need to rescue Clara not only creates an extra layer of danger, as well as some spotty chroma key effects,
Like I can fucking talk.
but results in a slightly different outcome than the clock tower scene in that, with Marty's help, Doc saves Clara, but fails to reach the time machine before it and Marty reach 88 and jump forward to 1985. Finally, instead of just suffering some minor damage in its time jump like in the first film, the time machine is utterly destroyed mere moments after arriving back in 1985, with Marty barely managing to escape it in time,
Damn it! Where's Chris Pine and Denzel when you need them?
and, following its destruction, utters a sad, heartfelt goodbye to Doc.
Well, Doc, it's destroyed. Just like you wanted. Doc, I thought I'd never see you again!
You can't keep a good scientist down! After all, I had to come back for Einstein. Well, I didn't want you to be worried about me.
Instead of ending right after Marty's farewell like a lot of films would do nowadays,
Since apparently bittersweet tones are considered good, and happiness is considered bad now.
Part 3 makes the effort to not only finish up plot threads from the previous films, but also ends up having an appropriately upbeat ending. With the former, there is the payoff to Marty's arc of learning not to impulsively prove that he's not chicken, when he decides not to partake in the street race that would have ended up ruining his future.
About 30 years ago, your father tried to prove he wasn't chicken, and he ended up in an automobile accident. If not for that accident, your father's life would have turned out very differently. The man in the Rolls Royce wouldn't have pressed charges, Marty wouldn't have broken his hand, and he wouldn't have given up on his music.
Read my
No!
facts.
Please, no, I cannot be fired. I'm fired.
This in turn leads to his girlfriend Jennifer realizing that her escapades in 2015 in the previous film were not a dream like she had previously thought. Soon after, as the two of them survey the obliterated remains of the time machine, we get a welcome reunion that, while admittedly a jumping the shark moment in how it completely throws out any pretense of accuracy,
I mean, how the hell was Doc able to power a flux capacitor with just a steam engine?
helps to show how Doc not only ended up having a happy life with Clara, but has also come full circle with his views on time travel in that he now understands that it by itself is not a bad thing, and that a person is capable of changing their fate.
Ahem, ahem.
Finally, this ending is a wonderfully tongue-in-cheek subversion of the frantic ending of the first film, as Doc prepares to travel to places in time unknown with his family.
Where are you going now? Back to the future?
Nope. Already been there.
Giving the series a fun, riding into the sunset conclusion.
At least film-wise.
I kid!
Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please remember to like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell. Also, follow me on Twitter at PCNHGuy. If you want to help me make more videos similar to this, or you just want to support my channel, maybe consider contributing to my Pop Culture and History Guy Patreon, and get a shout out in my future videos and other benefits.
Have a wonderful day, everyone, and remember the future is what you make it!